Hi everyone, welcome to AC Always Connected with Jessica, who will be leading the workshop. She's from Bread by Us. It's a bakery located in Hintonburg. I first just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Well, first off, this event is hosted by the AC Hub, part of Student Support Services. We just want to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Michelle. I'm the events officer for the Hub. Now, I just want to point out the participants button along the bottom of your screen. If everyone could open that, you can see there's a chat, there's a Zoom group chat. Feel free to use this chat throughout the entire workshop. If you have questions, you can submit them there. You can introduce yourself. I will be starting off with a question. And also feel free to turn on your cameras, just we want to encourage some face-to-face time throughout the workshop. But if everyone could open up the chat in the participants, and I'm going to ask everyone to type out, don't press send yet, I'll let everyone have a couple of seconds to enter their answer, but if everyone could type out their favorite restaurant in Ottawa. So if you have a restaurant recommendation, type it out in the chat, and then I'm going to count down and we'll all submit the answers at the same time. So I'll just give everyone a couple of seconds. Okay, that's good. On the count of 3, we'll send our answers. So 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, awesome. The amount of bread by us, that's so cute. That's so sweet. Great, thank you. So yeah, feel free to continue to use the chat button as we start the workshop. So now I'm going to introduce Jessica. So she's the owner of Bread by Us. And like I mentioned, Bread by Us is located in Hintonburg in Ottawa. It's a small batch bakery, and they were established in 2013 with the vision of sharing excellent bread with the community while striving to create a positive work environment for their team. They're known for sourdough breads, croissant pastries, great coffee, and caring service. And I know they're also open accepting orders. So we'll post the link if anyone's interested in the chat button. And now I'm going to turn over to Jessica to lead the workshop.
Awesome. So hi everyone. This is pretty weird for me to be doing this over a screen. I normally host workshops and I get to see people's reactions. So bear with me if this feels a little unfamiliar to me. But basically I have about 45 to 50 minutes to give you guys a good primer on how one would get started on baking bread. I would like to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A at the end. I will maybe check in once about halfway through to see if there's any burning need to clarify anything that I've already covered. So I'm not going to waste any time with a preamble other than just to say, I guess my goal for this class would be to get you familiarized with some really basic concepts like what is sourdough, how would I start to use sourdough in my baking, and just to familiarize you with a very basic country bread recipe that I think is really accessible to people at home. So I'm gonna open up my PowerPoint presentation real quick. All right. All right. So my assumption for today was that people are coming into this with little to no experience in bread baking. So I apologize to anyone if this is really basic, but based on what I'm seeing out there and what I've heard from my customers, a lot of people are getting into bread baking for the very first time during this pandemic that we are all a part of right now. So I thought I would start from the very beginning and from the basics. So bread, in a very fundamental way, is just a product that starts with a very, very simple ingredients like flour and water. And to that, we add fermentation, which is a process. And our outcome once that's baked is bread. So there's a lot of products that have flour and water. You might think of pasta, or you might think of a pie, or other pastries. But what makes bread unique is that it's a fermented product. So fermentation at its very core is simply yeast or bacteria that feed off of the sugars that are found in flour. And as they feed off of those sugars, carbon dioxide, alcohol, and acids are produced. And so those are the key components that make bread unique: carbon dioxide, alcohol, and acids. Carbon dioxide is what makes bread rise. So it's the gases that are produced. And then alcohols and acids are what make bread taste interesting and complex. So there are essentially two ways that we could approach fermenting our grains. The first approach is what you could do by simply going to the store and buying yeast. And I'm going to try to show you the difference between these two products. So at the store, you can buy something called instant yeast or active dry yeast, which comes in these little powdery balls. And the good thing about that is that it is a fairly simple process. So you decide one day, I'd like to make bread. So you go to the store, you buy some flour, you buy some yeast, you mix it together, you let it ferment, and you bake bread. What's interesting is that now we're seeing some of the disadvantages of this approach. One of those reasons, or one of those things, I guess, is scarcity, which we've never really experienced before. But right now, finding yeast at the store is actually quite difficult. But as you know, we didn't always have commercial yeast. It wasn't always available to us. Bread baking is thousands of years old, and our ancestors, the cultures that were making bread a long, long time ago, were not buying yeast from a store. Luckily, fermentation can actually occur spontaneously and naturally with really anything that contains sugars, and that includes flour. And so that is the basis of sourdough bread baking, is that it uses and it makes use of the natural yeast and bacteria that occur in nature. So people will often keep a culture of sourdough, which this is what mine looks like. And I don't know how good you can see into there, but it's basically a small amount that I keep. When I'm not using it, I keep it in my fridge, and when I am using it, I keep it at room temperature. And I'll go into some of the, details of how we would maintain this, how we would use it, and I'll try to do that in a very short period of time. So some of the advantages to baking with sourdough bread, like I already said, would be availability. So you literally, you don't need to buy it. You can simply make it by mixing together flour and water. Another thing that you may already know is that sourdough bread tends to have a pretty powerful and intense and delicious flavor. So all of the acids that are that accumulate in a sourdough are really flavorful. And because of those acids, another wonderful outcome of sourdough bread baking is that sourdough breads tend to have a really good shelf life. So you tend to have to deal with a more complicated process when you're baking with sourdough bread, but the advantages are numerous. I won't encourage you to necessarily take on one approach over the other, because simplicity is often, a really welcomed element to people's cooking and baking routines. But if you're really adventurous and you like the challenge and the craftsmanship behind sourdough bread baking, there are a lot of advantages. So essentially, I pulled this picture up from the internet so that you can see what it would look like, what a sourdough culture, how it evolves over the span of a day. So this is getting like maybe a little bit ahead. So I'll just backtrack for a quick second and say how a sourdough culture begins. So if you were to mix together flour and water in a bowl and let it sit there for, let's say, 2 to 3 to 4 days, eventually it would start to simply just bubble. So just like how if you left grapes outside on your counter, you might come back 3 or 4 days later and notice that they're smelling alcoholic or like they're rotting. That's the process of fermentation that happens naturally, because on the grape skins or in the air in your kitchen, there's yeast and bacteria everywhere. And the same is true for a bowl of flour and water. So literally this is spontaneously fermenting because there were yeast and bacteria in your flour, in your water, in your hands, and in the air. Now, that's the genesis of a sourdough starter, and I don't think I have the time today to get into the process of starting one yourself, but there is a lot of literature out there for how you would start a starter. But what you could do, and a lot of this is happening right now, is that people will share a part of their own established culture, like, and they will give it to you, and then you simply have to maintain it from there. So to start a sourdough culture on your own can take up to 2 weeks, because by the time yeast and bacteria accumulate in that culture and it's suitable to use in baking, it can take a really long time. But once the bakery reopens, you know, we always give out part of our starter to people who come in. That's something you're always welcome to do at our shop. A lot of other bakeries do the same thing, but right now there's a lot of community groups springing up, people sharing their own sourdough culture, and I'll just shout out one. It's called Friends in Knead, and that's KNEAD. Friends in Knead. They are a local sourdough enthusiast group, and they have a lot of great educational resources, and also I believe people are sharing their starters with one another. So moving forward from the point of, let's assume that we all have access to a sourdough culture at home because we've gotten one from our bakery, or we've started one ourselves, or somebody's given it to us. The bottle on the left, the lowest one, represents what a starter would look like when it has just been fed. So what that means is that there is very little activity of yeast and bacteria in it, and it's basically almost exclusively fresh flour and fresh water that has not been consumed yet by the yeast and bacteria. Michelle, can you give me a nod if you can see the bottle on the right, or is it covered up in your by the screen?
I can see 3.
You can see all 3? Okay, perfect. So the jar in the middle represents the culture as it starts to mature and as it starts to rise. So what's happening in there is that yeast and bacteria have started to eat the flour in the jar. And so it's literally starting to produce gases, and that's why it's climbing up the jar. And that could happen in a matter of a couple of hours. That's about where my starter is right now. You don't know where it started because you weren't here this morning, but I refreshed this morning, and I'm about at the halfway mark. And then the final jar on the far right is what we would call a mature, fully ripe sourdough starter. And that can happen depending on the temperature of your home. That could take about 12 hours to get there. Now, what happens to anything if you don't feed it or maintain it? So what will happen if we don't use what's in that jar on the right is that eventually the yeast and bacteria in there will run out of food because all of the flour will have been consumed, or all of the sugars, I should say, will have been consumed, and they're just too saturated in their waste byproducts. So we have to use the starter by the time it gets to that peak stage that it's in. So if we're baking bread, that's great news. We would simply put that culture that's fully ripe into the bread dough that we're making. But if we're not using that, like let's say you left it out because you forgot, and you simply just like walked away and forgot about it and didn't need to make bread, you would still have to tend to it when you saw that it's risen in its container like that. And what that means is you would actually discard or throw away the vast majority of what's in that jar, leaving just a small scraping. And then you would put fresh water and fresh flour. And so that small scraping would be what we would know, what I like to refer to, I guess, as a seed culture. So that's that tiny little blob that we're gonna leave behind actually has like thousands, if not millions of yeast and bacteria in it. And it's enough to propagate the next generation of your starter. So I'm gonna demonstrate what a refresh looks like. I'm gonna try to do that as fast as possible so we don't waste too much time. But so this is my starter here. And I don't know if you can see, but it is bubbly and ready to use. But I don't need it. I don't need it to make bread. I just left it out because I wanted you guys to see what refreshing looks like. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna throw the majority of this away, because if I don't, and if I just left this out till tomorrow morning, I would come back and it would be like fizzy. It would be really, really, really over fermented, and it would basically be really compromised in the sense that the yeast and bacteria in it would no longer be viable, and it would not make bread. So I'm gonna throw the majority of this away. And I'm literally just leaving a scraping. So just that kind of little bit of gunk at the bottom of the jar is all that I need to make the next sort of generation. And I'm gonna do that by adding some cold water. With a fork, I loosen it up so that all of that yeast and bacteria gets suspended into the water. And because I do this every day, I'm not measuring my quantities, but if I were to do it, it would be about, let's say about 100 grams of flour and about 70 grams of water. So flour goes in, and then I mix it up with a fork. One of the things I like to do is I like to ensure that it's really aerated. So that means that I'm kind of vigorously mixing it. And then I'm making sure that I'm scraping everything down from the sides, because that's where any mold would grow. If it did grow, it would grow along the sides, and we want to avoid that. And that is what we would call a refreshed starter. So that's refreshing your starter. So now what I have in my hand is a very small amount of yeast and bacteria with lots and lots of fresh food. It feeds off of the sugars in the flour, and it has a lot of fresh flour now in this container. So I get to decide now if I'm going to keep this at a room temperature or if I'm going to put it in the fridge. So if you don't need to bake with your sourdough culture, that in order to save on all that waste, we would simply put it into the fridge until the day before we needed to use it again. So I'm going to put this aside. If I was baking bread tomorrow, I would leave it out at room temperature so that it could rise again, because we need a very active starter in order to bake bread with it. What happens when you put a starter into the fridge is that the yeast goes dormant. It doesn't die it simply goes to sleep, and it ferments at a very, very slow rate. If anybody's ever left their starter in their fridge for too long or for a very long time, you might see a layer of liquid on top of it, and that's just alcohol accumulation. So that doesn't mean that your starter is dead or rotten or anything like that. It just means that it's been in the fridge for a long time. I normally find that that doesn't happen unless I leave it in for longer than about 2 weeks. What you would do in that case is you would throw away the liquid layer and you would aerate it, maybe let it warm up to room temperature, and then you would do what I did, discard and refresh it. And sometimes it takes 1 or 2 days to build your starter back if you've let it go dormant into the fridge. So I recommend that if you're not baking sourdough bread every couple of weeks or so, then it is very complex and almost pointless to keep a starter at home, because it's a lot of maintenance and potentially a lot of work to revive it if it's gone dormant. So the best thing to do for sourdough bread baking is frequency and repetition. It's a living organism, and if it's not tended to on a regular basis, it doesn't give us great results. So that's all I'm going to say for now about maintaining a sourdough culture, because I want to keep good time. But if any of that seems too complicated and not worthwhile, your option is always to go back to simply using yeast. And by that I mean the yeast from the store. Alternatively, there's a lot of good resources about sourdough baking. My favorite that got me started was the Tartine Bread book by Chad Robertson. I thought that went into some really good depth on sourdough bread baking. And that would be a resource that I would highly suggest you guys look into. Okay. So now I want to just, I guess, turn our attention to how will we make a loaf of bread. And so the recipe that I'm giving you today, I'm gonna show you guys the loaf that I baked with this recipe at home. So this was a really good outcome. I've baked this recipe a few times, and quite a few people have also. And the recipe that I'm giving you today makes 1 loaf of bread at 900 grams. And I baked this one in a Dutch oven, which is like a cast iron pot with a lid. But I'll show you some other ways to do that if you don't have a Dutch oven at home. And then the only question, I guess, for yourself is about how you would approach this recipe. So I'm giving you guys here 2 recipes that basically give you the same loaf of bread, but in one case we're using our sourdough culture, and then in the other case we're using yeast. So you'll see on the left side of this table is what you might want to write down if you're interested in, or take a screenshot, or however, whatever is easiest for you, but is if you were to use a sourdough culture, we would be using the recipe on the left. And if you wanted to simply use yeast from the store, we would use the recipe on the right. And the only difference that we would notice in these loaves is in flavor and possibly shelf life, but the one that uses yeast has a good shelf life as well. The sourdough loaf would for sure have a bit more of an acidic flavor, whereas the yeasted version would have a slightly lighter flavor. Sorry. I really want people to know that bread baking at home can be as simple or as adventurous as you want it to be. And sourdough bread baking can be pretty intimidating, and you still can get a really, really fantastic product with commercial yeast. So in the case of using the sourdough culture for our bread, actually, in both cases, we start the process the day before. And if you're using sourdough, you want to start your process when your culture is ripe. So you'll see here that I say feed 1 teaspoon of mature sourdough culture with, and in a separate container, you would put 150 grams of cold water and 200 grams of bread flour and 1 teaspoon of your mature culture. Mix that together, and we call that mixture a levain. If you were to use yeast instead of sourdough, then you would do the same process, but instead of putting that teaspoon of mature culture, you would be putting a quarter teaspoon of instant yeast. Now, this process gives us, so this morning I mixed the yeasted version, and this is what it looked like at 9:45, okay? So that's 150 grams of cold water, a quarter teaspoon of instant yeast, and 200 grams of bread flour. So if you were starting this at night, you might do this right before you go to bed, or I did it this morning so that I could bake my bread, 10 hours later. But what happens when you leave this out for overnight or in the morning is that over the span of the day, it'll rise, and I'm super jazzed about how this turned out today. This is what it looks like now, okay? So it rose for me almost all the way up to the top of this container. And I don't know what was up with my yeast, but it was really active today. So it actually only took about 5 hours to get to this point. And because it kind of happened quickly, I ended up putting it in the fridge so that it would sort of hold where it was until this workshop started. But I was watching it this morning and it was really active. But I think it's because I have some really, I just bought this yeast. I kept it in the fridge. It was a good quality yeast. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to bake with yeast that they bought a month ago, and it tends to have, I guess, less activity. So I mixed this morning. This is what it looks like now. I'm gonna scroll back real quick, back to the recipe, and just highlight where we're at now. So now that our poolish has ripened, I'm going to look at where it says day 2, and we're gonna mix the final dough. So if I had baked, or if I had used sourdough up until this point, again, the only difference would be that I would have used part of the culture instead of yeast, but it would still look, the levain would look very similar to this. I'm gonna exit this because I want you guys to see me slightly larger, because I'm gonna be mixing and showing you how we would mix this dough. Okay, and I'm happy to see that I haven't gone beyond 5:30. This is good. Okay. So one of the advantages to using this method, where either you're building a levain or a poolish, is that this long process of fermentation, like it took, from 10 o'clock this morning till now, is quite a few hours, or we could have done it overnight, is that a lot of flavor is going to be in this mixture. And all I did was mix it very roughly with my hand, and it didn't require any kneading. It doesn't require any fancy tools. It's like mix it real quick in a bowl and plop it into a jar or into a container. And it contains so much flavor. So I know you can't smell this over the screen, but if I smell, if I had to describe this smell, I would say that it smells like a beer. So a really kind of yeasty, slightly alcoholic, slightly acidic smell. And that's going to go a long way in creating a really good flavor for our bread. I've taken the liberty of scaling out my flour, but you'll notice that the recipe is in grams, and I do that because bread, the one tool that I would say is indispensable for bread baking is a scale. And you can get these for, under $20 at, let's say, the superstore, or a lot of, bigger grocers. And the reason why it's so important is that grams matter. Like 1 or 2 grams, if you're off on, like, let's say salt or yeast, it can make a really big difference for bread. And we want to always try to limit the number of variables. So having a scale will be your best friend when you start bread baking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it straight on here so you can see it really well. Excuse me. So my flour's here. You may have seen this technique of building a well for something like pasta dough, but it's just a really easy way to incorporate stuff by hand if you don't have a stand mixer. And you can do this right on a countertop. It doesn't have to be on a board like I have here. I just happen to inherit a really beautiful pasta and bread board from my grandmother. So my water is going to go into this well. So this is the 215 grams of water. You just want to make sure that the sides of your well can hold this water. I might have shot myself in the foot here. This might be a little sketchy, but let's see. And then I have salt, which I tend to add the salt after I'm done the initial mixing, but because of time considerations today, I'm just going to go ahead and add it all at once at the beginning of this mixing process. So I'm just going to dissolve the salt into the water. Sorry, I'm not sick. I'm just got a dry throat from all this talking. Okay. And then this tool here is called a bowl scraper, and you can get it for like $2. But if you don't have one, you can use a spatula or you can use your hand to get stuff out of your bowl or your container. You just want to be sure not to rip the dough too much, because that'll mess with your gluten structure, which is really important. And before I put it in there, just because I realize my well is kind of precarious, I'm just gonna cut it up a little bit. Oh boy, there it goes. I broke my well. Sorry, guys. Time out. Okay, so that was stupid. In the interest of wanting you to see what I was doing, I made a mistake of of making a well that was too precarious. So I'm gonna backtrack and just go ahead and put this back into the bowl. So I figure that I lost some water there, so I'm just going to estimate what I lost. Okay. So I'm adding back the amount of water that I think escaped from my well. And I'm just going to go ahead and incorporate this by hand. And the way I'm doing that is through sort of a process of like folding my water and flour together and also squeezing it through my hand. And once the flour and water is pretty well incorporated, I can then put it on my board, which would have been a much smarter approach. All right. So now that it's in sort of a shaggy ball and it's not at risk of spilling, I can put it on my board and I can continue incorporating. So bread dough is kneaded, and kneading is essentially a process of folding a dough and sort of pushing it forward so that the dough sort of comes together. And there's two important considerations for when you go to knead your bread. The first thing is that you're incorporating all of your ingredients. And incorporation just means that all of the flour and water have come in contact with one another. So we see lots of like clumps here. And so I'm just going to knead that until I don't feel any clumps anymore. So let's say I'm almost there. The bench scraper is a really great tool to help you to sort of take your dough off of whatever surface you're using. When it comes to mixing, or kneading, what you're doing is you're essentially stretching the dough over itself, folding it together, and then pushing it back together, and then turning it. So it's hard to do in slow motion because then it sticks to you, but this is the motion. Fold, stretch, press, and turn. Turn. So stretch, fold, press, and turn. I'm pretty happy with my estimate of how much water I lost because this dough actually feels exactly how it's supposed to. So people are tempted often to add flour to underneath. And I don't mind if we do that maybe once or twice with a little dusting. But if you add too much flour to help you knead a dough, then what you're going to do is you're going to stiffen it up a lot, and it'll actually change the consistency of your bread. So I prefer bread doughs that are a little bit on the wet side. People might find them a bit hard to handle, but they actually turn out a lot nicer. I don't really like dry breads, and I think a lot of people would agree. So I tend to formulate my breads so that they're a little bit on the wetter side, like this one. Okay. So as you can see, this isn't perfectly smooth, but it is well incorporated and there are no clumps of flour. What I've done through the kneading process is not only incorporated it, but I've also started to develop the dough. So the reason why bread has such an interesting texture and the reason why it can be really nice and chewy is because of the protein in it called gluten. So gluten is something that is the reason why bread has such a like chewy and wonderful texture. And if you don't develop your bread enough, if you don't knead it enough, then the bread can turn out a bit crumbly. So it is important that we do knead it somewhat. I'm gonna just look at these questions real quick because I saw one popped up that said, can it be over kneaded? So if you're doing this by hand, there's honestly no way for you to over knead it. If you're mixing a bread dough in a stand mixer, then you for sure you can over mix it. So, but by doing it by hand, there's not enough like mechanical force that you have with your hands that you could possibly over knead it. I'm just gonna take a quick second to wash my hands. So I am kind of at the point where I just have about 5 more minutes left of important things to note about this particular recipe and what next steps you would want to take. So I'm going to take the next 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll leave 15 minutes for some more follow-up questions. So back to my dough here. So it's a little bit lumpy still, and I'm okay with that. I'm gonna maybe knead it for a couple more turns. And you can probably already see how much smoother it got just having it rest there for a couple minutes. So that's what I would consider a really nicely developed dough. So our gluten is developing. That means it's organizing. So it starts off really, really shaggy and really disorganized. And if throughout the process of kneading, it gets smoother and smoother, which means the gluten in it is more and more organized. So what I'm gonna do then is I'm gonna stop mixing there. I'm going to put this dough into a bowl with a little bit of oil. And I'm just going to put the oil sort of like around the bowl. And then our dough goes in there. And this is now in its fermentation stage. So it's been mixed. And now we're going to let it sit here until it's doubled in size. And you want to cover this with some plastic wrap or something airtight. So I'm going to put this over to the side and quickly go back to my PowerPoint presentation. So hold on. Sorry, I need to share the screen. Did I do that? There we go. Okay, so this is a huge topic that is really hard to cover in this sort of setting, but when your dough is fermenting, it can take a very long time, and by that I mean 7 or 8 hours if your room temperature is really cold, or it can take a very short time depending on the season, or if your house is really, really warm. So you get to know the habits, or like I guess the patterns of how long things take to ferment the more you do stuff in your home. So for me, I'll just show you real quick. So this is the same dough, but this is what it looks like several hours later. So I mixed this around 10 o'clock in the morning, and it's now significantly bigger. And that took, I would say, to double in size, that took about 3 to 4 hours at my room temperature. But everybody's house is so different. So what's more important is that you guys sort of develop a sense for what to look for. And the most basic cue is that it's doubled in size. And I would suggest or urge for you to let go of any preconceptions of how long that should take, because the truth is that in the bakery, for example, we have summer recipes and winter recipes to because we owe our customers bread by a certain time of day, but the fluctuations are so dramatic that we actually have to completely reformulate our bread so that we can have like baguettes ready by 10 o'clock in the morning, for example. So I would suggest, just let go of any preconceptions of how long that stuff should take, and just look for doubling in size, and that your dough is sort of like light and airy. I don't know if you can see that well, but there's a lot of air in that dough. The last thing I'll tell you before we get to questions is what I think is an important step during your fermentation. So about an hour after mixing, I took a little video here of something I did, which really helps improve the overall volume of your loaf of bread. And so 1 hour after mixing, I did this. I hope this works. Okay, so this was this morning, an hour after I mixed it.
Nothing opened. I wonder.
Nothing open? Okay.
If you do share screen, and then maybe select a new link with that.
Okay. Okay. Maybe I'll stop. Let me see. I'll try something real quick here. Can you see something there?
Yes.
Okay. So I wet my hands and I stretched and folded the dough. So that step is important to the final volume of your bread. What you're doing there is you're creating tension in your loaf or in your dough so that it has enough tension to hold its volume. So if you find that you're baking bread and it's really flat, either because your dough, your flour is weak, or you're using a type of flour that is weaker, like a spelt flour or a whole wheat flour, folding your dough throughout your fermentation process, even just once, can have a really big overall improvement on your volume. And yes, that is 1 hour after it was finished mixing. I let it rest for 1 hour, and then I stretched and folded it. And then a few hours later, we got to doubling in volume. And at this point, this is now when I'm ready to shape the bread and bake it. And I think we're coming up to the time where I would like to give you a chance to ask me questions. And I recognize that we only got about halfway through, what it would take to bake a loaf of bread. But I hope that this was a good start. And if anyone wants to ask me questions about shaping or baking, I'd be happy to field those. And yeah, I'll open it up to you guys for questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was great, and you covered so much information.
I tried.
There were a few questions that came through on the chat. From Karen, he asked if, I think it was after the video, this is after the dough was kneaded and set to rest?
Yes, yeah, so my folding was done 1 hour after I mixed it, and I had let it rest. I walked away for an hour, I set a timer, I came back and I stretched and folded it.
And then Brooke asked, how long does it go in the oven for and what temperature?
Yeah, okay. So let me spend a couple of minutes on the baking process. So a couple of questions are coming in, like for shaping. And so a really quick, I guess, note on how we can go about baking this. So I mentioned the Dutch oven. I'm gonna put my camera down. So this is something that you can bake a loaf of bread in. It's a little bit more complicated, but the lid really helps to create a lot of steam so that your loaf rises really, really well in the oven. But you actually need to preheat this so that your loaf of bread goes into it hot. And then you would put it into your oven and keep the lid on for the first 20 minutes or so. A loaf of this size would take about 35 to 40 minutes total. But what's more important, if you guys have, this is another tool that I think is really important, is a thermometer that you can actually check the internal temperature of your loaf of bread. The loaf of bread is baked when it reaches 200 degrees Fahrenheit, or even 210 ideally. And the reason why that's important is because if you go through the process of baking bread that takes, 24 hours to do, it's really frustrating if you cut into it and it's not baked. So everybody's home oven is really different. And I would encourage people to use the tools available to them to ensure that it's actually baked all the way through, and a thermometer will do that. So that's 210 Fahrenheit. Another thing you can bake in is a loaf pan. You'll have to shape it into a loaf shape, which is a bit different, but totally doable. This is very accessible compared to a Dutch oven in terms of price point. And then also a very simple pie plate, super easy. And maybe I'll just take a moment to show you guys how we would shape it into this, because this is something that probably everybody has. And if you don't, you can literally buy an aluminum pie plate from the dollar store. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. So somebody asked about shaping tips. So this is how I would go about shaping this loaf of bread. And it is ready to shape now because it's fully risen. First things first, either grease this or put parchment paper down, or both. Parchment paper goes down. When I'm shaping this, I'm gonna put a tiny bit of flour on my surface, and I'm gonna pop this out. Okay. And this is being shaped into what we call a boule, which is a ball. And it's a very simple process of, again, stretching and folding. And I'm going to stretch and fold it all the way around so that it becomes a tense ball. So it goes like this: stretch and fold in, stretch and fold. You can see how this is becoming a round shape. Stretch and fold, 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 fold. Okay, so we're partway there. And now the last thing for me to do is to gather it into my hands like this, so that I'm basically bringing that seam together, and then I'm gonna round it on the table. So what I'm doing here is I'm bringing the seam together, so that seam down there is disappearing, and I'm creating tension in the bread so that it's becoming sort of a tense ball. And so that's our boule, or our loaf. And then it just goes seam side down into this pan. And you can, at this point, what you would do is you need to let it rise one more time, but it doesn't take a very long time if it's at room temperature. So what you're looking for if you're using an 8-inch or 9-inch pie plate is that this comes out to the ends. So for the recipe that I gave you, it basically, as long as it's touching the sides slightly, which it's not yet, so see how it's still about an inch away from the sides. Once it fills out, it's then ready to bake. And like I said, it would go into an oven, a high oven. So we want to aim for like 450 degrees Fahrenheit if you can. And it's going to need about 35 to 40 minutes of baking. The one step that I haven't shown you because it's not ready to do that yet would be scoring, which is essentially slashing the top of the bread. So what you would do is you would take a knife, the sharpest serrated knife that you have. This one's really dull, it's not going to work. And you would basically score or like cut the top of your bread into one, you know, that you could do one score, or you could do a cross, or you could do all sorts of artistic interpretations. But we only score a loaf of bread when it's ready to go into the oven, so I'm not doing that. All right, is there any other questions that came through while I was talking there?
There was a question from Nicole asking about your ratio between flour and water. She said she was recommended 50-50, and she noticed that you do 70 grams water and 100 grams flour. Is that personal preference?
That is personal preference, but I'll tell you the main reason why. So I like a stiffer, keeping a stiffer culture, because I don't have to feed it as often. So if you can imagine, a liquid starter is like less nutrient dense, and so it needs to be refreshed more often. So it's my personal preference. But yeah, that's why I do it.
Okay. There's a question from Alan. Why does it have to be without air for rising? I always used a clean cloth.
So in summer, that's usually okay because the humidity in your apartment or your house would be high enough that your dough wouldn't form a crust. But I find that most of the year, the humidity levels in my apartment or in my bakery are really low. And so if I don't put something airtight over it, like I sometimes use like a garbage bag if I need like a big quantity, or I put like a lid on a container or plastic wrap. If I don't do that, what happens is there's like a crust that forms over the dough. So it's basically to ensure that the dough doesn't form a crust while it's rising. Yeah.
Awesome. There's a question about scoring. So it says, I've also seen people use stencils with flour to make contrast on the top of the bread for aesthetic.
Yeah, so what that person is saying is, so what you would do is either with like a flour or like a sifter or a sieve. I'll just do it with my hand. So you'd put like some flour on the top like that, and then you would score some sort of artistic interpretation, like some people do a wheat stalk or a leaf or something like that, and the flour provides contrast. So if you can imagine, when it's cut and then it's baked, the top of the dough will have sort of a flowery finish, but then where the cuts are will be like the color of the inside of the crumbs. So it really comes out bold and bright. But yeah, it is entirely for aesthetic. I do find though that putting flour on the top of the loaf helps me to score better, because the blade that you use tends to stick quite a lot to the loaf, but when you put flour on top, it actually cuts through a little bit more easily. For the oven temperature, 450. Yeah, you want to bake bread as hot as possible. So I also saw somebody asking about spraying the top of your loaf. The person is referring to adding some kind of mist or humidity or moisture to your oven. And what that does is it allows the bread to continue to rise when it goes into the oven. So hot heat and a bit of moisture in your oven. You can even insert like a pan with a bit of water as you're preheating your oven, so that the chamber of your oven becomes really humid. And what that does is it prevents the crust from forming too quickly. So if you can delay the formation of the crust somehow by adding moisture to your oven, then you can get a really, really good rise, and that's called an oven spring. So that like bounce that your bread gets when it's first put into the oven is it can have a lot of potential, especially if you put humidity and if you do it at a really high heat. Yeah.
There's a question from Karen. I think this is the last one. I know we're at 6 now. So Karen says, I have some really lovely whole wheat flour. Do you just adjust the amount of levain poulish when you replace some of the white with the whole wheat bread flour?
So technically, you can replace, so in my recipe, you're welcome to use whole grain flour instead of white, but what you'll notice is that the dough will be significantly stiffer. And the reason is because whole wheat flour absorbs a lot more water. So the bran in whole wheat flour soaks up a ton of water. So what you'll see is a stiffer dough. If you want to compensate for that, I would recommend adding extra water to your final dough. You know, one thing I would suggest is to start, if you're not accustomed, like if you're new to bread baking, start by making a loaf of white bread. And once you've nailed that, once you've become consistent with it, slowly, I would say 5% of the flour at a time. So let's say if it's a kilo of flour that you use, you know, maybe start with like 50 grams of whole grain flour the next time you do it, and 950 grams of white flour, just as an example, until you see how the dough reacts. So gradually introduce whole grain flours. It is a lot harder to work with. It's more difficult to handle, and and the volume of your loaf will have will be hugely different. So like anything, learn how to walk before you run. White flour is the walking version of bread baking, and whole wheat flour is the running version. So get yourself to that point, I would say gradually. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jessica. That's great. And I know there's some of the attendees are commenting just about how awesome the workshop was.
Thank
We
you.
record this, so it will be posted on the Algonquin College Student Support Services website. But before everyone leaves, do you mind if we just quickly take a couple of screenshots? So if you want to be part of the photo, you can turn your cameras on. If you don't, you can turn your camera off. But just after every workshop, we're taking a few screenshots. So count of 3. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. And I'm just going to go over because we're doing gallery view and I have one more page. So we'll get everyone to smile again. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing real quick. So the bakery's currently closed to the public except for 1 day a week we're doing bread deliveries. So I just noticed that somebody's sharing the website, which I really appreciate, but the most up-to-date information on what we're doing is on our social media in terms of what we're baking for customers. So, and everything is evolving pretty quickly, and I'm finding that updating the website's a little more tricky for me than social media. So I appreciate people sharing Bread by Us stuff, but keep checking in our social media if you don't mind. Yeah.
Thank you. And what is your Instagram?
Oh, it's at Bread by Us.
Bread by Us. Okay, perfect. Great. Thank you. Awesome. So our next AC Always Connected event is tomorrow at 11 a.m. and it's with F45. So it's an Ottawa gym. They do 45-minute workouts. So they're going to be joining us. It's free for all Algonquin College students and employees. And that's the Zoom link, and you can register on the Algonquin College Student Support Services website. Leanne just entered it there in the chat. Okay, thanks again, everyone, and thank you so much, Jessica. It was great.
Bye.
Bye.